So it gives me great pleasure to welcome a longtime colleague and one of our most fundamental pillars of emo from where we began. Irene Lo from Stanford University is going to be talking to us about mechanisms optimization and education policy with long-standing work over many years incorporating deep technical methodologies, but also staying grounded with actual practical implications. I can't think of anyone that exemplifies the ethos of emo's work more than Irene. So really, it's a great honor to have her present for us here today, and I look forward to this talk, and I hope we can give her a warm welcome for emo this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco, for that lovely introduction. And thank you all of you for being here. I know it's hard to get here after lunch, so I appreciate you being here for my talk today. And I'm very, very excited to tell you today about mechanisms, optimization, and education policy. I want to begin this talk by asking you a question. Okay. What are some of the biggest challenges that you see now in K-12 education? Okay, so I sat down to think about this a couple of years ago. We were kind of on the tail end of COVID, and I identified a few which I'm going to tell you about in the context of US public schools, but which I think are really quite global problems. Okay, first, academic outcomes are at historic lows. So in the wake of the global pandemic, a lot of students did not have the opportunity to have very desirable learning environments. And so what you see here is data taken from reading and mathematics scores from the National Assessment of Education Progress. This is the only source of standardized testing that's comparable nationwide in the US. And you can see it that looking at reading scores in 2022, we saw the largest drop in reading scores year by year since 1990. And then also the first significant drop in mathematics scores also in the year 2022. In addition, these academic achievement drops are actually inequitably distributed. Okay, so what we're showing here are breaking down by percentile. The top is the 90 students at the 90th percentile. The bottom is the students at the 10th percentile of what these drops look like between 2020 and 2022. And so you can see that the gaps between the highest academic achievers and the lowest academic achievers have been growing in these years. And this is especially concerning because a lot of these gaps are highly correlated with demographics, such as socioeconomic status or racial background. And so what you can see on this plot is a time series of different racial and socioeconomic achievement gaps. Let's take a look at the blue one, which is the white-black achievement gap as measured by mathematics test scores in 8th grade. And so on the y-axis, we're measuring this in standard deviations. You can see that this gap has been fairly persistent, basically at the same level from 2003 to 2017, so it's not going all the way up until COVID. And just to interpret this number for you a little bit, this about 0.8 standard deviations is equivalent to about 1.5 to 2 grade levels. So that would be the difference between sort of a 6th grader and an 8th grader. Okay. In addition, something that I think a lot about, especially in the US context, is that the schools in the US are actually not just segregating, but resegregating. So let me show you 2 illustrative statistics. The first here is a plot of the percentage of black students in the western states of the United States who attend schools that are 90 to 100% minority students. Okay, and you can see that this percentage has been decreasing since segregation in schools was first ruled unconstitutional in the 60s, but then has been increasing again since the 80s. And here's another cut of the data. I'm using a different metric. Here now I'm looking at a measure of racial concentration. Okay, I'm looking at the percentage of schools in one particular school district, the San Francisco Unified School District. And I'm looking at what percentage of schools have a concentration of a racial subgroup. And this racial subgroup is concentrated if they comprise at least 45% of the students going to that school. And again, you see this pattern. Of course, now we're looking at a single district. And so there are a lot more sort of more interesting drops that don't get averaged out, or kind of discontinuities. And each of those correlate with different policy decisions that were made in the district at these times. Okay, but again, that same pattern, decreasing in the 60s until about the 80s, and then increasing again. Okay. And so it turns out that a lot of these issues are actually highly correlated with each other. Right, so there's recent research from the Stanford Educational Opportunity Project that says the following in this paper called Is Separate Still Unequal? New Evidence on School Segregation and Racial Academic Achievement Gaps. They show that racial school segregation is strongly associated with the magnitude of achievement gaps in third grade, and then with the rate at which those gaps grow between third and eighth grade. And they also find that racial segregation appears to be particularly harmful when it concentrates minority students in high poverty schools. Okay, so just to repeat, the concentration of both, the confluence of both socioeconomic segregation and racial segregations together in schools is highly correlated with large and growing academic achievement gaps. Okay, and so that's sort of the context we're entering into. And one question I want to look at today is, well, how can algorithms, mechanisms, and optimization help? It feels like we're very far from all of these education policy problems. Okay, and so I'm going to try to answer or explore this question today in the context of work that I've been doing with the San Francisco Unified School District. I want you to have in mind the problem of assigning students to public schools in San Francisco Unified School District. We're thinking about incoming kindergartners, and so pre-COVID, those numbers were about 5,000 students per year. Post-COVID, it's dropped to more like 3,500, and they're assigned to one of 150 programs at 70 different schools. And I have a map here of the San Francisco Unified School District. Each of the red dots is an elementary school. So this is where students enter kindergarten. And I want to think about this in the context of actually which schools do students get to go to. And the goal of assigning students to schools is to have those schools serve the educational needs of all the students. Okay. And so if we go back to the problems that I just raised, one sort of sub-goal we might have when thinking about meeting everyone's educational needs is diversity. So if I look here this is a racial dot map of San Francisco using 2010 census data, and you can see that different colors correspond to different races. And it's quite visually evident that the neighborhoods in San Francisco are very racially segregated. Just to point out one example, the black students, or the black population, they comprise just about 5 to 6% of the population in San Francisco, but you can really see this like bright green area in the southeast, which is where most of them live. Okay, and so you might think, well, I want my schools to be diverse, right? I want them to be integrated. I don't want to have this segregation of schools that can lead to my historically marginalized groups doing even worse than everyone else. But then you might also think there's research that shows that it's useful for students to have community cohesion, to be able to get to school very quickly, to build a community with those who attend their school. And so you might actually want people to go to school close to home. For a lot of school districts, this is also just in terms of costs. For students who travel further, they have to bus them further, and that's very expensive for the district. You might also care about letting people choose which school they go to. In a district like San Francisco, there are many different schools with lots of different programs. Some schools have Spanish programs, Cantonese programs, special education programs, and the parents and families may know better which are the appropriate programs for their children. And then finally, it's a really big district, and so you might want the whole process to be transparent, sort of easy to understand what's going on. Okay, so these are a lot of sub-goals you might have in mind once you've stated this sort of overarching goal of serving the educational needs of all students and families. Okay, and so today what we're going to do is look at this problem of student assignment. We're going to look at it from the perspective of education policy, and then we're also going to look at it from the perspective of mechanism design and optimization, and kind of see what we can learn from each of these different disciplines. I'm going to focus mostly on what we can learn from mechanisms and optimization because that's my area of expertise. But here's what I know about student assignment from the education policy world. Okay, so if you've never heard of student assignment before, that's probably because you grew up in a place where they use neighborhood assignment. Which school do you go to? You just go to your neighborhood school, right? It's kind of the closest school, or the one, sometimes they have neighborhood catchment areas. You live in the catchment area, you go to that school. Okay, and this is a very good assignment policy for the proximity goal, if you want to let students go to school close to home and develop community with those that they go to school with. Now, there's another type of student assignment policy. These two are probably the two most frequently discussed in education policy. That's known in my academic world as school choice and popularly as the lottery. Okay? The idea here is that we're going to let students choose where they go to school. You get to express these choices by submitting your preferences. It's my first choice school, my second choice school, so on and so forth. And then all of this goes into an algorithm with some randomness, which is why it's known as the lottery. Okay? And the idea is that, well, now people can go to school sort of wherever they like. We're no longer coupling residential area with where you go to school, and so maybe we can decouple residential segregation from school segregation. And we can also address choice, let people express which are the schools with the better programs for their children. Okay, so it turns out that mechanism design is an area that has thought a lot about this second type of policy known as the school choice policy. And so here's how mechanism design thinks about school choice. Before I talk about how mechanism design thinks about school choice, let me talk about what is mechanism design. Okay, so for those of you who've never heard of mechanism design before, a mechanism is an algorithm with strategic input. And for the purposes of today, I just want you to think of an algorithm as a set of instructions, and usually it's a computer that executes that set of instructions for you. Okay, and so the computer is going to take some information, we call that the input to the algorithm. It's going to follow the set of instructions with that particular input, and then it's going to give you the result, which we call the output. Okay, and what a mechanism is, it's now this input is strategic, and what mechanism design does is we're taking into account the fact that we have strategic input when designing the algorithm. Okay, so going back to school choice was first formulated as a mechanism design problem about the early 2000s, and you can kind of think of it as first an algorithm, because you can think, well, what's the input? The input is all these preferences for schools that families might have. The output is the final assignment of students to schools, and really it's a mechanism because families care a lot about where their kids go to school, rightfully so, and so they're going to game the system as much as they can to make sure that their child goes to the school that they want them to go to. Okay, so there's really, the strategic considerations in this setting are kind of first order. Okay, in addition, we also have some other inputs. We might care about the schools, how much space they have. Some schools might also give priority to students who live closer, or students who they have a special need, or students who pass some kind of test to go to the school. And so those are all inputs that go into our mechanism. For today, we're just going to consider that only the students' and families' preferences are strategic. Okay, so this is sort of the mechanism design view of school choice. And you might ask, well, why would I want such a view? Okay, so to illustrate this, let me go back to some examples from the early 2000s. The first is in New York City. Okay, so in 2003, applying to public school in New York City looks something like this. There are even more schools in New York City than in San Francisco. I don't know the number, but that tells you it's more than 70. Okay? You get to apply to up to 5 schools of those 70. And then there's 3 rounds of processing applications. The schools look at everyone who applied to them. Let's say a school has 50 seats. It admits 50 of those students. Okay, some students get multiple offers, and so they're going to turn down some schools, and so then the schools do another round of accepting students. And so they do 3 of these rounds. At the end, students accept at most 1 offer, and there's also a waitlist system. Okay, and so what were some problems? One problem, major problem, is something that we call congestion. Okay, there are just not enough rounds of clearing to assign all the students. In fact, about 30,000 of the 90,000 students ended up unassigned at the end of this process. So that's a third of students who just don't have a school assignment. Okay. In addition, because you might end up unassigned, students really had to strategize about which 5 schools to apply to. 5 was just sort of not enough, 3 rounds was not enough, and so you kind of want to think about, well, which schools am I more likely to get placed in, and try to list those in your list of 5. Okay, so going back to our goals, that means we're really limiting choice. There's a whole lot of people who are not assigned at all, let alone to something that they wanted, and also the whole process was not very transparent. There's a lot of sort of hidden gaming in the system. Okay, and so in this context, the first thing you might do is realize, well, if we go back to what New York City was doing, they basically had an algorithm, right? The algorithm was these rounds of accepting and offering. Okay, and this is something that you can automate. Okay, you could do many, many more rounds of this if it's automated and you collect the information that you need for it up front, rather than having it happen sort of decentralized way over many weeks. Okay, and so sort of takeaway number one, algorithms can help us formalize and automate these complex processes. Okay, so let's say you formalize it, and you might formalize it the way that Boston did. So they had a particular mechanism, which is known as the Boston mechanism. Okay, at the beginning, students actually submit all of their preferences, their first choice, their second choice, their third choice. And then the computer does the following. Each school will look at all the students who rank them first, and then it's going to accept as all of those students unless they don't have enough space. And so there are going to be some schools that are not full of first choice students. So then they can keep going and look at, well, how many students rank me second? Let's accept those students. And then you keep going until the school fills up. Okay. And so it turns out that, again, you face this sort of strategic problem where, because schools are filling up based on students who list them highly, you kind of want to guess at which schools you have the best chance of being accepted at and list those higher. Right? In fact, Boston Public Schools explicitly told parents this. This is taken from their handbook introducing Boston Public Schools in 2004. It says, for a better chance of getting your, quote, first choice, unquote, school, consider choosing less popular schools. Okay, so you're explicitly being told to game and also kind of being nudged toward a particular type of gaming. Okay, but all of this feels very sort of strange, right? Why are you asking me for my choices, asking me for my first choice, but then telling me it shouldn't really be my first choice? Okay. And so how does mechanism design approach this problem? It says that let's actually consider the strategies or the incentives that are induced by the process that we're using. Okay, and so if our goals, if one is transparency, you might want your procedure to be what's known as strategy proof. That means that there's no incentive to game the system. Everyone does as well as they can by actually listing their first choice first rather than listing some pretend first choice first. Next, you might also care about choice. And so one measure of choice is something known as Pareto efficiency. The idea here is that we can't improve every student. We can't give everyone a school that they prefer to their current assignment. If someone gets a better school, someone has to get a worse school. And then there's also something in this literature known as stability. The idea here is that if an outcome is not stable, then there might be pairs that try to match outside of your recommended match, and that might cause your whole market to unravel. Okay, and so what the mechanism design literature did is it formalized a lot of these goals and then identified mechanisms that satisfy some of these goals. In particular, two of the popular mechanisms are known as the deferred acceptance mechanism and the top trading cycles mechanism. And it's been shown that both of these are strategy proof, so it's in everyone's best interest to report their true preferences. And then TTC, or top trading cycles, is Pareto efficient, while deferred acceptance is stable. And there's no mechanism that can achieve all three of these goals. Okay. And so that original 2003 Abdolkadiroglu-Sonmez paper laid out a lot of these trade-offs. Then the two papers in New York City and Boston kind of presented this framework of looking at student assignment to the decision makers in those districts. And as a result, both districts chose to use deferred acceptance to assign students to schools, and those deferred acceptance actually also being used in both those districts today. Okay, so just to summarize, the mechanisms in this case helped us to formalize and incorporate the effects of strategic behavior in these complex processes. Okay. What I want to do now is return to our case study in San Francisco and kind of develop those ideas a little bit more. Let's get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of what actually happens and how you might go about deciding on a student assignment policy. So as a reminder, this is the San Francisco Unified School District. We have this problem of schools being very segregated. And so actually in 2011, a number of the same Economists and researchers worked with staff at the San Francisco School District to switch to using school choice to assign students to schools. So school choice has been used since 2011, and one of the primary goals of using choice was to disentangle neighborhood and school segregation. So even though the neighborhoods are very segregated, hopefully the schools can be less segregated. And so you might ask, did it work? Okay, and so here's some data from 2018. I'm looking at socioeconomic segregation in San Francisco as measured by eligibility for free or reduced price lunch. I'm abbreviating that FRL for short. And so you can think that eligibility for free or reduced lunch is a measure of socioeconomic need. So in the background, I have a heat map. And this heat map is showing the percentage of students living in different areas of the district who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. And then on top of that, I have gray dots and red dots. And the red dots are the 50% of schools that had the highest percentage of students attending those schools who are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. Okay, so you can see this district had full district-wide choice. Many students indeed were choosing to go to schools that were not just their neighborhood school, but we still see the same patterns of socioeconomic segregation at the residential level replicated at the school level. Okay. And so due to this and other issues, in 2018, the San Francisco Board of Education initiated a redesign of their student assignment process, and their goals were diversity, predictability, proximity, all with a lens of equity of access. Okay, and so that's where we started working with the district. And so what I'll be telling you about is based on joint work with my wonderful collaborators here. Okay, so when we started working with the district, they already had some policy concepts in mind. As I mentioned, sort of the first two policies that people will think of are neighborhood assignment and citywide choice. Okay, the issue with neighborhood assignment is that the neighborhoods are very segregated, and so you're just going to have very segregated schools. And the issue that they were observing with citywide choice, which they had been using since 2011, was actually choice-driven resegregation. And so when we look at historical choice patterns, many families choose to attend schools where the demographics are very similar to their own, whether that's racial or socioeconomic. Or rather, they choose to prioritize schools on their list of that sort. Okay, and so the district is sort of thinking, how do we sort of overcome these issues? What other policies might be out there? And they came up with a whole bunch of policy concepts, the central idea of which was zones. Okay, what is a zone? A zone is going to be a geographic area that contains multiple schools, but that's going to be a small number of schools, say 3 schools or 10 schools. And you're going to choose amongst the small number of schools in your geographic zone of residence. Okay, so this was sort of their idea that they wanted to explore. Okay, so let's go back to mechanism design. How can mechanism design contribute to this conversation? The first thing that we did was we asked, well, if you have zones, you still need some kind of mechanism within your zones. So let's understand what is the mechanism you're using now and what mechanism would you like to use with the zones. And so we took a closer look at the mechanism or the pseudocode for what they were running. It looked like it was something that was kind of something in between deferred acceptance and top trading cycles that ended up being not strategy proof. Okay, so it was a sort of difficult to understand mechanism, so we had a conversation with them about this. In 2019, they switched to using deferred acceptance. Okay, and they also decided implicitly to use deferred acceptance in the zones as well. But then the next question is, well, what policies? Like, how do we reconcile zones with all of these different views of possible student assignment policies? And so what we did was we suggested a new set of policies to consider that combine this idea of zones with ideas from mechanism design. Okay, the first idea in mechanism design is that there are these things called priorities. I mentioned them earlier, that a school might prioritize students who live in the neighborhood of the school, or who have a sibling attending the school, or who are from a particular background, perhaps historically disadvantaged background. Okay, and the general principle of mechanism design is that the mechanism designer can kind of affect what type of allocation you get by setting the priorities appropriately. Okay, and so we just did a first pass at this. Let's set some priorities that roughly align with historical need in terms of educational access. The next thing we did was, well, we looked at if one of your primary goals is diversity, then the mechanism design literature actually says one way to do that is to reserve seats. What do I mean by that? Suppose I have a majority and a minority group. What I can do is I can reserve some seats at every school just for the majority group or just for the minority group. And if I do that, then the students get sort of first choice at their reserved seats. And so if there are a lot of students from one group who want to go to a particular school, then they get first access to their reserved seats, but then the other seats are held out for students from the other group. And if there are not enough students of a particular group, then other students from other groups can take those reserved seats. That's what it means to have soft reserves. Okay, so this is an idea from mechanism design, and so we said, why don't we also use this idea? Because this is probably going to do a better job of achieving diversity than sort of just zones on their own, because there's nothing in the zones in and of themselves that is encouraging diversity. Okay, and then finally, we also compared these to the typical mechanism design approach of just using priorities as the only tool. Next, let's talk a little bit about optimization. Yes, there was a question.
The zones, do they mean that like can truly only be assigned to students in the zone, or that they will be prioritized?
Good question. So the question is, are students restricted to attend schools only in their zone, or are they just prioritized at the schools within their zone, and then they can also choose from schools outside of their zone? The answer is it's complicated. Let me give you a little sense of the complication. There are many different language programs, special programs. There are citywide schools. There are also students with special needs. So each of these has their own kind of special category for deciding on whether you just get priority or you can have or choice is restricted. And also, we did actually also explore the effect of having zones where you just get priority at your zone versus zones where you're restricted to choosing within your zone. But yes, I think the initial intention was that you were restricted to choose within the zone. Okay, and so that's what we're going to be considering over here. One more question. Yeah, what a great question. The question is, has there been pushback against using reserves? Let me take that question as part of a discussion that I'll have as part of the slides later on. Okay, good question. Okay, in fact, there's a lot of places where you could get pushback, so I'm going to discuss a few of those as well. Okay, but first, let me tell you a little bit more about our methods. The next question might be, okay, like zones sound good, but which zones should we use? And so this is a question where optimization is particularly well suited to come help. And so what we did in this particular work was we took an approach where we generate possible zones by putting together geographic building blocks. And we want these building blocks to satisfy certain size, shape, and balance constraints. And so instead of showing you all the constraints, I'm just going to illustrate them through some pictures and words. Okay, so we might have shape constraints. We have contiguous zones where you can get to any one part of the zone from any other part just by walking within the zone. Non-contiguous zones tend to have islands, like this dark purple zone has 3 islands. And then we also have a lot of different balance constraints that were desired. Balance of number of students across zones, the number of students in the zone and the seats in the zone, demographics across different zones, school performance and popularity across different zones. You really don't want there to be sort of the zone with all the good schools that everyone wants to go to and the zone with all the bad schools that no one wants to go to. That's not a good zoning. Okay. And then what we did was took a 2-stage approach where we first generated these zones, and then we simulate counterfactual choice. How do we think people will choose, given that it's new restriction to zones? And then we evaluate these zones by simulating choice on them. Okay, so you could imagine a world where we combine these all into one massive optimization problem. This is very hard. We've tried and not yet been able to succeed. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of skip over this slide, but I just wanted to also mention here are some of the techniques that we use when generating zones. We took some optimization approaches, and we also took some approaches that were inspired by recent advances in political redistricting. And so there's a lot of interesting just mathematical questions here as well, and also applied optimization questions. Okay, but let me keep telling you about how all of this optimization and mechanism design actually informed the policy decision. So what I've told you about so far is just sort of this stage where we're suggesting potential policies and simulating how we think they might perform. So to simulate how we think they might perform, we actually have to go back and predict how we think families will choose given these different policies. Okay? And once we have the prediction and we run them through the simulation, we also need a way for someone who's not us to look at the results and to be able to evaluate how all of these different policies are doing. And so we built a number of different visualization tools and dashboards. And based on all of that, we found that there's potential to significantly reduce the percentage of racial minorities who are attending high poverty schools. And so let me quantify that for you a little bit. Okay, so again, we ran simulations. We're using a choice that's estimated using historical choice. So we're using historical choice from 2014 through 2019, and then we're using simulations here, the population of students and applying to kindergarten for 2018-19, and also the spaces available in the schools in that year. And we're comparing 4 policies. We have the just zones policy, we have zones with the reserves, we have the priorities policy, and we have the actual assignment in 2018-19. So let's look first at diversity. We looked at a lot of different metrics of diversity that we developed in collaboration with colleagues at the education school. The one that I'm focusing on today is the percentage of African American, Latinx, and Pacific Islander students in schools that are mid to high poverty. And this threshold of 67% for reduced price lunch eligibility is 15% more than the district average. Okay, so that's how we came up with this arbitrary looking threshold. Okay, and so as an absolute number, this is viewed kind of as mid to high poverty in the education literature. Yes? Reserves do not depend on the preferences. Yes, we predefine the group that students belong to based on their block of residence. Yeah. Good. And so the main takeaway I want to show you here is that by switching to 2 of these policies, we could either move to using zones and reserves or priorities. So both of these were influenced by mechanism design. We can actually reduce the percentage of minority students attending mid to high poverty schools from about 1/5 of students to about 1/10 of students. Okay, so that's a significant reduction in that number, and it's driven by fewer schools being mid to high poverty, and also fewer of these students from minority groups being assigned to those schools. And yeah, if we had just gone with sort of what the district was exploring, we would be somewhere like on the left-hand side, basically not much difference from the status quo. Okay. Yes?
Was it easy to simulate the previous appointments for 2019? Because I guess after 2019,
Yes. Yes. Yes, good question. So we have lots of different choice models that we estimated using different years, including, the question was, actually before 2018, the assignment policy was not strategy proof, and so we don't know necessarily that the preferences are actually true preferences. So we've tried this using lots of different choice models, estimated using different years, including only after 2019. We've also done this using actual preferences. We've done this for different years of students. The qualitative trade-offs that I'm showing you today continue to hold. The exact numbers are different. Okay. And so then let me actually just concentrate on those qualitative trade-offs. So instead of looking at the numbers, I want you to look at sort of this green diagonal. Right? What I have in the rows are metrics for the district's goals of diversity, predictability, and proximity. And you can see that there's sort of, let me just go back and hide the top one for a moment. Okay. If I'm just looking at the district goals, there's no one policy that, well, there is actually. There's one policy right here in the middle that seems to meet all of the district goals. But then I add on, also thinking about choice. This is how much families like the schools that they're being assigned to, as measured by the percentage of families assigned to one of their top 3 choices. You can see that there's no one policy that really achieves all of these goals. There's trade-offs between them. And essentially, one of our takeaways is that you kind of need all this machinery to be able to understand and quantify what do these trade-offs look like. Okay. And so looking at this, the district said, oh, wonderful, there's this one policy in the middle here that seems to achieve all of the district goals of diversity, predictability, and proximity. It seems to significantly reduce parental choice, which makes sense if you're restricting the schools that families can choose from. But that seems fine. That looks like a good policy. And so the staff and Board of Education decided in 2020 on the following policy, which is essentially the zones and reserves policy. They said they're going to restrict choice using geographic zones with reserves. The zones will be medium-sized to balance between predictability, proximity, and diversity. This was also based on our work showing that if the zones are too small, you can't get diversity, and they didn't want them to be too big because then the proximity metrics were bad. And they also wanted to improve outcomes for target populations using equity priorities. Okay, so particular families, including children, foster care, homeless children, will get top priority at all the schools. And as I mentioned, the Board of Education approved this policy in 2020 and for implementation starting the 2026-27 school year, which is now actually coming up kind of soon. Okay. And so looking at the work that we did there, you can see that mechanisms and optimization can help the district decision makers navigate the complexities. Right? There are all these trade-offs we don't know. We kind of have guesses for what the directions might be, but we don't know which ones will do better than the current policy when they're all mixed together, which ones will do worse, and the magnitude of those trade-offs. In fact, we also had some more fundamental questions, like, well, what even are the zones that we're going to use? And that can also be approached using quantitative and algorithmic tools. Okay. I also want to point out that this approach is sort of not the full answer to the question of how should we decide on education policy. Okay, so a couple of things to consider. First, this policy decision was done on a very short timeline. We were basically producing data and showing to district decision makers the day of, and without really having time to even process it ourselves. And so there really wasn't time for nuanced and engaged community engagement. Okay? Nuanced, informed community engagement. And so I think something to consider is to get more input from marginalized communities in particular and to understand the effects of such a policy on them. There are also negative effects of switching to a zone-based policy. I pointed out that it significantly reduces parental choice. That can have effects like leading to families of means opting out of the district. Okay, so now you have selection between public and private schools. That's kind of been affected by your policy decision. And then there's also other negative effects of zones. Those on the boundaries of zones are now suddenly very negatively affected. The effects of reserves, there might be backlash. How do you define these? When we did this work, we used racial characteristics. When we're updating the work and actually implementing it, we were not using racial characteristics. How does that affect your accuracy, your ability to target populations? Okay. And as I mentioned, this sort of simulation, mathematical mechanism and optimization approach is not the only approach. And also student assignment is also not the only approach to improving the educational opportunities. And zones are also not the only answer. In particular, what we find is basically to actually help zones become more equitable, other outside changes need to happen as well. Something interesting that came out of exploring a zone-based policy was that I felt like in some sense people could grasp and understand the implications of a zone-based policy and inequalities there much more than sort of inequality that came out of a full district-wide choice system. The full district-wide choice system is sort of like, well, people choose, that affects things, and then there are bad outcomes. But with zones, it's very clear when there's one zone that has all the desirable schools and one zone that doesn't. One zone that has a lot of geographic barriers and one that doesn't. And so, interestingly, having the zones actually enabled the beginning of a lot more focused conversations about some of these other system changes that need to happen as well. Okay. And so what does that mean in terms of next steps for the district and for our team? First is implementing the policy. You might notice that we haven't actually decided which zones. We just said some zones. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, there wasn't really a lot of space for community engagement, and so I think families may be less interested in which policy and more interested in what does that mean for my choice of schools, right? And so I do anticipate that there'll be community engagement that's kind of focused on the zone selection period. That is probably the right period to be focusing community engagement. That doesn't sort of excuse not doing community engagement earlier, but it means there's still a lot of opportunity ahead of us. And then also supporting a lot of the system changes. So enabling transportation within zones, thinking about where should we have to move around, language programs, other special programs, so that different people in different zones have access to them. And also evaluating the effects of this policy after it's taken effect, and not just simulating what we predict the effects will be beforehand. So that's sort of a high-level picture on how we use tools from mechanisms and optimization to support this one particular policy decision. And I want to spend a little bit of time now thinking about equity and access. Okay. And to think about equity of access, I'm going to borrow a framework from the Glossary of Education Reform. And it says that this is a definition of equity of access. It says, the ways in which educational institutions and policies strive to ensure the removal of any barriers that might prevent some students from equitable participation in certain courses or academic programs. This is one definition of equity of access in the education context. And so if I specialize this to the student assignment context, then we can think about equity of access as the ways in which student assignment strives to ensure the removal of any barrier that might prevent some students from equitable enrollment in a program serving their unique needs. Okay. And so I know I just sat down to think about what are some of these barriers in sort of the life cycle of a family's experience of enrolling in a school. And so this is what the parental experience looks like. You're attending school in 2025, so you actually need to start thinking about it in fall of 2024, like right now. Right? Parents first form their preferences over school so that they're ready to submit their preferences to the lottery in January. In March, they're told they're assigned school. And so if we think about barriers to equity here, you might think about, do parents have equitable information? Does everyone know what schools are available to them? We recently attended a whole bunch of community engagement sessions where we learned the answer is really no. A lot of information is just based on word of mouth and very reliant on social networks and who knows what. Equitable understanding of the algorithm. Okay, you have this algorithm that's being used to assign students to schools. Does everyone understand how they should interact with this algorithm? Maybe less important exactly what the algorithm does, but more what that means for their strategies and how they should be interacting with it and what they need to know. Okay, we've also talked about equitable assignment, and so we do have some analysis of this in the paper, looking at all of the different outcomes I mentioned before by subgroups. And then finally, well, just because I assign you to a school doesn't mean that you can actually enroll and go there. Right? Maybe you have no way of getting to that school. There are a lot of other barriers also, in addition to transportation, but that's just one example. And then finally, we want to think about the procedural justice of this entire process. Right? Do families feel that this whole process, this set of steps that they have to go through is a fair process for enrolling in schools? And so, given the time that I have, I'm going to just focus on a few of these. The first one that I want to talk about is equitable information about schools. So what I'm showing you here is the number of programs in the submitted rank-ordered preference list for kindergarten applicants in the 2018-19 school year. Now, if you're someone who's worked on mechanism design, you know that the most common assumption about preferences through the school choice mechanism design literature is that people know all their preferences and they submit a full rank-ordered list. Okay, so in San Francisco, that means I'm going to rank order list all 150 programs that I can apply to. Okay, so this is how many people actually rank. It's much fewer than 150. And you can see that there are systematic differences. Here I'm showing systematic differences by race. We also see this by socioeconomic status. Okay? In particular, families from minority groups tend to list fewer schools. Okay? You can see it that the I believe this is the mean number of schools listed by Black or African American students is 3.4, whereas the mean for white students is 15.9. Okay, and if you list fewer schools, you're less likely to get a school that you list. Right? And so then, depending on how the assignment is done, maybe that means you'll end up with sort of the leftover schools that nobody wants. Yes? Yeah, good question. We talked about this informally with district staff, and they have a number of hypotheses for what might be driving this. One of them is lack of information about their school options, but also just lack of information about how the whole process works. There tends to be a common incorrect belief amongst especially parents from certain geographic areas that correspond to minority families. There's this incorrect belief that if you put your neighborhood school anywhere on your list, you'll definitely be able to go to your neighborhood school, right? And so if you put your neighborhood school first, they might think, I just put it first, I can go there. So that's one piece of lack of information. And then we also hear from the staff that the parents they don't know how to navigate thinking about 150 schools. And so they really only learn about the few schools that the families that they talk to. Yes, yeah, right. Right. Just the number of schools in those areas. Yeah, I don't think there's a big difference in sort of the geographic dispersion of schools across different areas. There's definitely differences in who has the means to drive their kid to school, which could also affect, making your list shorter. Yeah, so this is anecdotal. I'm not saying this is causal. I'm not saying this is the only driver of this pattern that we're seeing. But it's a great point. There's a lot of other ones I haven't mentioned here. And then I also want to talk a little bit about procedural justice, because this is actually something that we're starting to do a little bit of work on. Okay? So families have different perceptions about how well school assignment in general is serving their community. So in 2019, before we started working with the district, they had a round of community engagement to learn how the public thought about the three policy concepts that they had come up with. Most of these concepts centered around zones. Okay? So the question they asked families was, how likely are the three different policy concepts to meet your family's needs? So you can see concept 1, concept 2, concept 3. The main thing I want you to focus on is on our Black and Latinx families. You can see that they just uniformly rated all of these concepts a 2 out of 5. Okay, so not a lot of confidence that any of the concepts would be serving their family's needs. There are also various surveys and interviews that were conducted. So one quote is, "It's always families and communities with fewer resources that get stuck with lower quality schools and less choice." So these families were really not happy with the idea of being confined to zones of schools near where they were living. Okay. And so the challenge is to consider the procedural justice of our algorithms and research. Like, it doesn't kind of stop where we were before, where we just simulated all of these different possible approaches and kind of stayed agnostic as to how the decision-making process went. I think that we as quantitative researchers actually have quite a significant role that we can play in helping to engage community stakeholders in all of the different parts of the decision-making process. So let me tell you about a little bit of work that we're doing there. Okay. So let's say we really want to have participatory zone design. Okay, we really want community members to be able to engage in deciding on what the zone boundaries should be, because that's the big decision that's coming up. This is quite a hard problem, not least because it's a computationally hard problem. Okay? Zoning is what is known as an NP hard problem. That means it takes a really long time for a computer to find a potential well-performing set of zones. And this has been recognized and heuristics developed in the context of neighborhood school zoning, where you're just drawing zones around a single school, and also political redistricting, where we're trying to divide a map into sort of voting areas. It turns out that multi-school zones have additional constraints that make them different and potentially harder than both of these previously studied problems. Okay, so compared to neighborhood schools, neighborhood zones, now the zones have multiple schools. And so we can't just look at the composition of students in the zone when we think about how diverse our schools are, which schools are students going to. We also have to layer on choice on top of that. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a way of doing this in one big optimization problem yet. Then compared to political redistricting, there's been a lot of really beautiful work recently using sort of sampling, Markov decision processes, MCMC processes to kind of sample, generate an ensemble of potential zonings. The difference between the goals there and multi-school zones is that we're not trying to generate a representative ensemble, we're actually trying to find good zones. Okay? And in addition, there are a lot more constraints in the school zoning problem, as you saw before. In political redistricting, the main constraint is population balance. You want each of the zones to have the same number of voters. But we saw we had, balance of students and seats, students across zones, schools across zones, demographics across zones, lots of different constraints. Okay, and so there's a computational challenge that actually then engenders also a participatory challenge. Okay? Because there are so many things to consider, and it's not at all clear how to come up with good zones, then stakeholders are not really able to say, well, what do they want from zones? Right? This depends on what's achievable, and nobody really knows what's achievable. And the only way for what we found for stakeholders to give meaningful input is to react to potential zones, rather than telling us up front, this is the level of diversity we want, or this is the level of proximity that we want. Because maybe ideally I want my school to be walkable and also this level of diversity, but it's not possible to satisfy all of these desires from all of our different stakeholders at once. Okay. And so to address this issue, we came up with what we're calling optimization meets participation. It's an iterative framework where first we developed new, faster computational methods for school zoning. And what that allows us to do is to show zones that we generate to stakeholders, get their reactions to those zones. We then translate those reactions into a sort of new optimization. We're kind of changing, how much should we constrain the diversity of different zones? How should we think about how far we let people travel? Should we add in any more geographic barriers? We have this sort of iterative loop where people can give feedback on the zones. Okay. So computational methods for optimizing, coming up with zones very fast, and then constraint exploration. Stakeholders can look at the different zones that come up from different combinations of constraints and kind of react either to, oh, I'm okay if we are a little bit less stringent on how big the zones have to be, or also react to the zones themselves. I don't like this part of that zone. Okay. And so when we first put together these tools, we basically just had sort of like dashboards, right? A lot of visualization of metrics. But what we've been working on recently is actually using LLMs to allow users to interact directly with the zones. Okay, what do I mean by this? Before, when we just had these dashboards, we kind of needed this workflow that looked like, okay, we are doing the optimization on our end, and then the stakeholder goes home and looks at it, decides what constraints they want, and then when we meet in our next focus group or our next meeting with a district, they tell us what they want, and then we have to go back and we optimize it, and in the next meeting we show them the zones. Okay, there's just a lot of back and forth that slowed down sort of this ability to kind of learn what you want from a zone. Right? And so what this automated tool allows is it lets the stakeholder put in natural language what it is that they want to change with the zone. In doing this, we're building on existing work by some of my colleagues who are looking at using LLMs to allow natural language input to mixed integer programs in general. And when we do that, now we can take the optimization researcher out of the loop. Right? We can have just the stakeholder interacting with this tool themselves. Okay. This is all very preliminary work, and so what I wanted to illustrate with this is that I believe there are a lot of interdisciplinary research opportunities to support more procedural justice in our process of doing this research, the process of coming up with the policies, the process of deciding on the specifics of the policies, and especially to help support equity and access in policy design where there's a lot of algorithms. Right? We have now natural language ways of interacting with complex algorithms. So just to summarize, my main takeaways from today, algorithms, mechanisms, and optimization can help decision makers navigate the complexities of education policy. Algorithms can help formalize and automate the complex processes. Mechanisms can incorporate the effects of strategic behavior in complex processes. And so we saw all of this at work in our work with the San Francisco Unified School District. We drew on mechanism design to help come up with new policies that we thought would be more suitable for achieving the district's goals. That required an understanding of how these mechanisms work. Then we used optimization to come up with suggestions for zones. Like there are various stakeholders who are suggesting just drawing zones by hand. Let me tell you that just drawing zones by hand is not going to get you very far in a district like San Francisco. And then all of these tools we put together to illustrate the trade-offs and quantify the trade-offs between different policy goals, and that allowed the district decision makers to come up with a policy recommendation. Finally, I just wanted to end with sort of a note of encouragement. I've been really excited this EMO to see so many papers on community engagement, participatory research, and just all the really great talks where people have been thinking about how to do the community engagement part much more deeply than I ever have. And so I think there's really an opportunity for us as a community to think more deeply about these research opportunities on improving equity and access and community engagement in these different algorithmic tools. Okay, so thank you, and I think I have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Irene, for the engaging talk. Are there any questions in the crowd? I'm glad to pass the mic around.
Thank you so much, Irene. I think this is just such a wonderful example for what we're trying to do. I wanted to ask if you have any sense of the order of preferences among different groups and whether they're or not they're consistent, because you showed there are discrepancies in kind of like how many schools different demographic groups will choose. And I also know that for the first 6 years of data, it was not strategy proof, so maybe that's not quite representative, but maybe through focus groups or whatnot, like how and what that would change in like the downstream like mechanism design process if those preferences are fairly homogeneous or not?
Yeah, good question. A couple of people have brought up now that the data we're using is from when the mechanism was not strategy proof, so how do we deal with that? And I believe it was told to the public that the mechanism was strategy proof. And so we're operating under the assumption that most people did report their true preferences, but we do some robustness checks with the few years of data that we have from when it was strategy proof. Do we see systematic differences across different populations of students? So we're not the only researchers in school choice who use this method of using historical choice to simulate counterfactual choice or to predict, I guess estimate is the correct word, estimate these choice models and then use these choice models to come up with estimates of how people would rank schools. And so there's prior work by Parag Pathak and Peng Shi that kind of did this more carefully in the Boston context. And they found that actually the preferences of the student groups stay fairly consistent across years. Not across groups, they're quite different across groups, but across years they're fairly consistent, but what really changes across years is the student population. And so that's also something that we've been seeing. Our less careful analysis kind of aligns with what they're finding, that the biggest thing to worry about is not so much the within year accuracy of the models, but how much are your populations changing from year to year. That doesn't quite get at your question, but I think it's sort of, if I had to name sort of the biggest question in that space that's still kind of unknown for us, that's probably the one.
Hi, Irene. Mi nombre es Flor Ángel. Yo soy bióloga, pero tuve la oportunidad de ser maestra de CONAFE. CONAFE es una institución federal donde le dan fomento a la educación.
My name is Flor Angel. I'm from Oaxaca, and I currently work in biology, but I used to be a teacher in CONAFE,
Es un Consejo Nacional de Fomento Educativo.
a national council for the advancement of education.
Y esto que nos cuentas, te agradezco mucho que nos hayas contado acerca de este trabajo que estás haciendo. Fíjate que este trabajo no está lejos de la realidad, en el sentido de que esta experiencia que tuve en esta comunidad siendo líder para la educación o maestra, muchas de los padres de familia me comentaban: yo quiero que mis hijos vayan a una preparatoria, pero como la comunidad está a 2 horas de donde se encuentra la preparatoria, pues les es difícil, y entonces sus hijos se quedan en la comunidad y ya no tienen la oportunidad de seguir estudiando. Entonces,
So you're saying this experience is not at all different from what it's like in my community, where I talked to many parents for whom they said that I would like for my students to go to other schools that are far away, but we don't have the means for transportation for taking my students to certain places.
y entonces esto que nos comentas acerca de estas zonas adecuadas y de prioridad para estos niños o para pues, estos jóvenes es muy importante, ¿no? Pero en el caso de México, la situación es que sí tenemos que, o bueno, las personas que se dedican a la docencia, implementar más políticas, que en este caso yo le entiendo que nos vienes platicando de los lineamientos, para poder de alguna forma infundirle a las comunidades que tengan ellos la oportunidad de tener lugares cercanos a sus comunidades, con escuelas adaptadas, con este tipo de transporte, ¿no?
And I appreciate hearing about this work and learning about precisely the challenges that you're facing is what we need to be having in our communities, where people need to be informed of different mechanisms that can help give prioritary access and more equitable outcomes.
Sí. Sí, y la pregunta es, en el caso de México, ¿cómo sería este tipo de selección para estos lugares o estas zonas de prioridad, ¿no?, para la educación?
So her question is, in the case of Mexico, what do you think would be the priority areas that we could prioritize to improve, to port these mechanisms or these thought processes in the Mexican context?
Yeah, what a great question, and one which I am not at all the right person to ask. I would love to hear your thoughts actually on, I think as a quantitative researcher, what we're able to do is show you, okay, here are some particular goals that we know how to think about. Which of these goals are important to you? Once you let us know what the goals are that are important to you, then we can say these are the kinds of mechanisms you might want to explore. Are there additional goals that you find important for which that are not included in our view of mechanism design approaches to student assignment? And so that's the question I would bring back to you. Like, one thing I can imagine is that Alessandra yesterday mentioned that in addition to just reassigning students within the existing schools, you may want to think about which schools to invest in, right? How do we make the schools better? Maybe in the short term, diversifying the schools is an important goal, but maybe in the medium to long term, what you want to do is put a lot more resources into these quote-unquote unpopular schools. So I think there are also a lot of these types of questions I would like to understand about the Mexican context. In the US context, it's sort of, school funding is really hard to change and is broken in lots of ways, and so that's why we find it valuable to focus on sort of these non-funding approaches. But maybe in Mexico it's different, and so those are some of the questions I would like to ask you before trying to answer your question. Sorry, Francisco, can you? Oh, we don't. We have the live translator.
Exactly.
We have the live translator.
You have one way.
Great.
Well, thank you. I think we're a little bit over time. So